Hello. So, as she said, I'm Tanya. You might be following me, I might be following you on Twitter, Tanya X Short. But I am the captain of Kitfox Games, and we've been working on procedural content in our game since we started 5 years ago. We generate terrain in Shattered Planet, we generate cult members in the Shrouded Isle, clan members in Six Ages, and myths in Moonhunters. We've embraced system-driven design. And our upcoming game, Boyfriend Dungeon, thank you, yes, thank you. It's a dungeon crawler about dating your weapons. It's okay if you haven't heard about it. I'm here to tell you. But I'm here to break your heart a little bit because we're only generating the dungeon, or the dunge, as the kids call it. The hack and slash is generated. The boyfriends and girlfriends and envy friends are not generated. And this presentation will help you understand my decision-making process there. I'm also the co-editor of 2 textbooks on the subject. Procedural generation in game design came out last year. Procedural storytelling in game design is coming out next year. So keep an eye out for an exorbitantly priced book near you. I first got into procedural system design back in 2013 because I felt not just that they surprised and delighted me as a player, but also me as a developer. It was just way more fun to play test. And they've gotten more interesting since then. The uniquely developed orcs of the Mordor Nemesis system are famous for feeling not just like unique enemies, but also uniquely responsive to the encounters and environments that you find them in. And on the indie side, the Red Hook team, based here in Vancouver, has done an excellent job of mechanizing shifts of personality in their procedural people. When your people become hopeless, you feel for them, and they've done a great job there. And there have been so many successful, excellent procedural games these days that sometimes it's easier as designers to remember what the systems were and how they were implemented, but harder to remember why they work and make any kind of definitive statement about how they achieve their user experience. Because it goes so much deeper than just the interface, right? It's right in the guts of each of these games. So this talk will cover 3 major topics: why to bother with legible systems, what it means, and how to go about pursuing that. So I hope that's what you're here for, because that's what you're going to get. At UX Summits and as game designers in general, those of us who have an interest in game design, which is most humans, to be honest, we tend to talk about making our games more accessible, especially making our mechanics and interface more readable, how to present those inputs and outputs as intuitively as possible, right? So that players can unconsciously know what to expect. We often talk about controls, and we talk about feedback and interface, usability, to maximize engagement for adjusting our tie. But we don't often talk about how to do that for the systems themselves. So let's think for a moment about the difference between content and systems. If we were generating 1,000 types of enemies, we would immediately start to discuss how to distinguish between those 1,000 enemies. How much difference between each one is enough? How much is too much? The first 100 variants might go kind of smoothly, but the next 900, maybe not so much. They might be a waste. Some of these are useful variants and to generate, and some aren't. Which are more useful? How do we measure it? It can get very stressful. Thankfully, other people have solved it on the content side. Whoop, back. Considering the problem of infinitely varied procedural content, Kate Compton is an expert, and she coined the 10,000 bowls of oatmeal problem. Quote, I can easily generate 10,000 bowls of oatmeal, each oat being in a different position and a different orientation, and mathematically speaking, they will be completely unique. But the user will just see a lot of oatmeal. Perceptual uniqueness is the real metric, and it's darn tough. And she's brilliant, you should read everything by her, but I think that that's primarily the case for content. But what about the systems that are generating that content? Systems can't use that same metric. I am going to use the term system a bit loosely in this talk. By systems, I generally mean patterns of inputs and outputs that are a bit abstracted, experienced through time. So they're 4th dimensional. For example, at the top of the screen in Super Mario Bros., there's 4 simple systems implied here for scoring, currency, progression, and time limits. These are more complex than a single input and output. They're experienced over time with various implications for the player, so I think those count as systems. So when I'm using the word procedural or systems, I might mean something as simple as this. where we might strive for perceptual uniqueness in content, we want legibility in systems, including procedural generation. Legibility as in allowing the player to decipher this new language that the game is trying to teach them. Imagine how much worse Mario's systems would have been if they were hidden from the player. It'd be ridiculous. If the player can't perceive your system, should it exist? If they can perceive it, but they can't understand it, I still don't really understand why this is in the game at all. So, I mean, I get a lot of arguments from people who think that maybe procedural generation is different, it's special. Maybe you think you want to make a living, breathing world, and you don't want your system to be decipherable, because even after the player has spent dozens and dozens of hours, you want it to feel natural. And it's possible you're right. I don't think so, but it's possible, and I'm going to tell you a story to illustrate why. My first salaried job was at Funcom. Woo, Funcom. I know there's a Funcom. Yeah, Nick's over there. On Age of Conan, Hyborian Adventures. And I'd already played the game for a month. I was a fan. I bought it on launch day. And I was a big MMO nerd. Yes, 2008. Woo. And I'd spent that month fighting hundreds or thousands of trash mob NPCs like this poor pirate here. I would kill them, I would get experience, and I would move on with my life. And then I joined the team as an AI designer. And I found that the AI in that game followed a Maslowian hierarchy of needs. Almost every single NPC in the game had a complex script-loading prioritization system where they would seek safety and sleep and food, and a few lucky NPCs would self-actualize. I mean, usually that would mean like playing a talk animation or warming their hands by a fire or something. But yeah, all I saw, and the only thing I had any reason to see, was a bunch of NPCs playing random animations and doing random things. The whole system was completely invisible, and it was a beautiful piece of technology that was completely wasted, in my opinion. So when you're making a living, breathing world, you should still consider why, and who sees it live and who sees it breathe. It's worth noting that I'm not saying literally all systems should be legible. In Moon Hunters, for example, we didn't expose the generation algorithm of the combat maps. Like, there wasn't an inherently interesting component there for placing rocks and trees. So it didn't make sense to expose that. But there are other procedural systems that did benefit from it. And it's also totally okay to use procedural generation as a content creation tool. But I just want to encourage you to think that even if it is just a creation tool, maybe there is more value you can get out of that feature, out of that system. And I understand why it's scary. If you don't want the player to feel like there's 10,000 bowls of oatmeal, you probably don't want to show them how to make the oatmeal. But if your system does anything remotely interesting at all, like concerns humans in a way, then game players will probably find it interesting to tweak the dials on that machine you've made. Long, long after they've gotten tired of it as pure content. They can actually get interested in the system itself. They can engage with it in a deeper, more committed way. And this creates a gameplay of noticing, as Mitu Kandakar put it, letting the perception of the system itself become entertaining. Endgame players might not just perceive the unique systemic outcomes and describe them to their friends, but actually work towards building those systemic scenarios and share in that ownership. I mean, if you're making a moment factory, then in my opinion, you should let your hardcore players volunteer to work in the factory. So let's say you have a system that would benefit from being more player legible, okay? Maybe you're a little bit on board with me at this point or willing to entertain me. Let's think about what that would mean. We can start by comparing system legibility to what we use to make text more legible. One of the most important things about making something legible is to make it perceptible. We don't hide important text behind weird fonts. We don't try to disguise our text as pictures. We make it able to be seen. Do the same with your systems. The Shrouded Isle is a game of trying to survive. And in the initial prototype, choices would give or take away those resources you see at the bottom, like shelter and food and things like that. And a lot changed about the game. But this stayed, and we ended up actually exposing a lot more, specifically because players needed to be able to perceive the systems that we were creating. So we changed the resources around a bit, but a lot of them were actually already there in the prototype. They were just secret, and players had no way of knowing they were there. Like a house would mutiny against you, but you don't know how they felt about you. So you can see a lot of the new information that we exposed pointed out by the white arrows. And we did that not just to aid in the player strategy, because this is a management genre game, but also because it's a game about sacrificing your villagers to placate Chernabog, as you do. And your villagers are procedurally generated with virtues and vices. And you'll notice there on the left, Preben, Cagney there, he's a kleptomaniac. Great. But also, we've exposed a lot about the system in that little tiny space. We've exposed what virtue it affects, the -30 it affects, the down arrow, and it's bold, which communicates different things about the system to players who are paying attention. And so making the system and its effects much more distinct helped players engage with the system by knowing it was there at all. Once the player can see that your system is there, the next step would probably be to make it clearer. Help them actually understand it. The metaphor here would be going through your text and trying to use as widely understood words as possible that are still somewhat accurate, even if some of the delicate nuance is lost. One of the more common arguments that I hear from system designers that don't want to show players their work is that they'd have to explain too much. It's too subtle, they won't get it, and it's just really important that we have this really complicated formula for adding up these numbers because that's how it has to work. So I personally feel that writers also would like to use these fancy words, but it is better to use words that everyone understands. And it's okay to lose subtlety sometimes to make things clearer. So Moon Hunters generated mythologies, right? Generated dungeons as well, but those weren't very legible. Well, the myth generation, for clarity, exposed elements of that myth generation system whenever possible. Whenever a character gained points towards a certain thing. Now, the personalities were very, very basic. There were 9 personality traits. You could get points towards anyone. In this one, she's gaining points towards cunning. In combination, they would create a very, very dirt simple myth, which was just handwritten one-liners that would be strung together based on what choices they made, what deeds they did. The thing that's nice about this clarity is that players could actually engage not just with the system existing, but also start working out how to engage with it more deeply. They could think about, okay, well, if this is a compassionate myth, what does that imply about the choices that I did make? What other choices could I make to get other endings? And they couldn't do that if it was obfuscated behind complexity and vagueness. So if you have a distinct system and you have a clear system, well, the clarity might not just come through language, right? The clarity might come through what images you use or even what metaphors you use. Part of the reason why Moon Hunters was successful in its myths, I think, is because we chose the metaphor of the Epic of Gilgamesh. We took virtues that we kind of recognize from other books that stole from Gilgamesh, like Iliad and the Aeneid and all that kind of stuff. We could have chosen lots of other metaphors. There are so many metaphors of personality. Thank you, BuzzFeed. But the point is that we chose something to make the game more clear. People could see the beginnings of what metaphor we were using and apply it themselves to understand the rest of the system. So choosing your metaphor is important. And using that metaphor coherently is step number 3. So once you have an idea of how you're going to surface your system, being coherent about it. Humans are really bad at taking incoherency. We just kind of try to make sense of things instinctively. And it's a lot of effort sometimes when things don't actually make sense. If you're using logic from one system that doesn't apply to another system, your brain will still try if you see those systems next to each other. So let's not waste our players' time with nonsense. For systems, this means driving all of your systems with the same consistent and discernible logic. The more exposed, the better. And then the way it functions can be understood, and you've lifted up the hood for players to come in and tinker around. And the Shrouded Isle, I think, was partially successful because it had such a consistent internal logic. This whole idea that you can measure how much fervor someone has and then add it up in a column applied throughout the game, up to all the game systems, and became the basis for the DLC that we built as well. It was much, much easier to make a DLC at all in a system-driven game if you know what the molecules of your system are and how to extend them outwards. So, of course, dunking someone in salt water would purify their disease or turn them into fish people or whatever, and that would be viable for survival. And so that's not the fish people, but the coherency is part of why that I decided not to generate boyfriends in Boyfriend Dungeon. It's a silly game in premise and tone, but it's also primarily thematically about warmth and love and humanity, none of which is particularly coherent with procedurally generated dialogue being exposed. But if you want to write that, I will 100% play it. And coherent for your game might mean something different than coherent for my game. It might mean a little bit more chaos applied in certain points. And as long as that chaos is consistently applied and the system is still decipherable in some way, I would call that coherent, personally. And at peak legibility, a system might be so coherent that it's completely predictable. But just shy of that, you can still have a system that feels intuitive and rich to the player without them quite understanding why. They just know that your world makes sense. Even if kleptomaniac means -3 to obedience, that makes sense somehow because the rest of the game supports it. I said there were only 3, but I'm going to really quick add a 3.5 because meaningfulness might not technically count as legibility of text, but I do think it's important because there's no point in making the text legible if it's irrelevant. The same applies to your system. If you're surfacing a system to your player, how meaningful can you make it? How deeply can you integrate it with your other systems? I think this is the beauty of the Mordor Nemesis system. It's so distinct and is so clear that it has a readily recognizable name we all know. It's almost more recognizable to me than the series itself, and it continues to inspire us. Similarly, the Darkest Dungeon Crisis and Quirk system is dirt simple, but it's clear and it's coherent and it's meaningful to players. It's crucial to the gameplay. I mean, I could go on with examples like this forever. Basically, all of your favorite procedural systems, in my opinion, follow this model. At some level, players are able to not only see what's been generated, but interact with it meaningfully, and it affects the rest of their game, with no exposed logic going to waste. All right, so if you're on board and you want to know how, this is the step for you. I mean, these are great goals, but sometimes it's really hard to put into practice. You know, you've made a procedural system or a fairly complex system, and you're not really sure how to show it to players. Well, this is how to identify and boost your collaborator of your machine, your algorithm. So game designers in the room, when you're working on a system that you want to be more legible, step number 1, in my opinion, is to write out in words, usually words, you can try diagrams, but it's very hard, moment to moment of how you want your systems to intersect from the player's experience. So in a canceled game that I worked on, there was a medieval castle simulator in which we wrote, quote, "The king is depressed when his wife dies. Every time he sees a portrait of her on the wall, he cries. Redecorating the castle helps alleviate his mood." Now that seems like a fairly simple little moment. Nobody's going to necessarily write that moment on the forums, and in fact the story went on quite a bit longer to include civil wars and the stable boy and all sorts of things. But the point is, for this little user story, you can already see multiple systems being surfaced to the player. From the player's perspective, the player can see, oh, decorations have an effect on mood. Oh, wait, characters have mood. Oh, wait, characters can die. And all of these things are things the player needs to understand in order for this user story to ever occur. And so if you don't do this, because it's very tempting not to, it's very tempting to just start building your cool systems and how cool they are. Without these, you might end up with, I don't know, durability on the paintings, but you don't need durability on the paintings. You need to know that the queen is in the paintings. The content matters more than, I don't know, the color of the paint, for example. And so that's useful information if you center your production on user stories. For system designers in the room, I think it's very important for you to think about what the molecules of the emotional core of all your systems is, and define those and expose them as much as possible. Like, what is the lowest building block in your game? Now, for some games, maybe that is literally molecules, and good luck with that. But for other games, maybe you have people. In King of Dragon Pass and its spiritual successor, 6 Ages, which we're publishing, it exposes these procedurally generated clans people, what their stats are, what their personalities are, the loyalties, and those form the building blocks of your clan. And so later, when there's other systemic interactions to be done, then they can be part of the exposed systems there. So for example, this advisor, she clearly knows a lot about stories, but part of why that little advice there that she gives you, no story I know includes falling lampreys, it's important because she's knowledgeable on the subject, and you can go find that out. Whereas otherwise, it might just be random text. Number 3 is for interface designers. I know there's at least a few of you out there. Now, you're already probably fighting with all the game designers about trying to hide some of that complexity from the player. I'm here to say that the complexity should stay there, but just let it be more opt-in for the player. I think thinking about it in terms of helping the player understand your game's vocabulary first, that's step one. Make sure the player knows what words mean in your game, or what images mean, teach them the dictionary. And then step two, teach them grammar. What are they supposed to do with those words now that they know what monster actually means in your game? What can they do with it? And then finally, once they're fluent, maybe they can actually find other information in your systems that the previous two people could not access. So there's a lot of opt-in information in the Shrouded Isle. Maybe there's too much. It's possible we put too much on the screen in that first moment, but this is late in the game. This is after you've already survived for a while. You'll start seeing a lot of different information about the different villagers. And so we actually get questions now and then from players like, why don't you show all the information? It's not just strategy, it's also letting people get acquainted with the game. And for feature designers among you, I think it's very important to investigate adding investigation into your game. So whenever you have deeply systemic moments, it will be a little bit confusing sometimes. Something unpredictable will happen. That's part of the point. That's the purpose of the game. So, I think one of the successes of Prison Architect is that you can go back in time a little bit and see how the current situation came to be. You can look at people's relationships, opinions on each other, and I think generally, if you have systems, letting people either wind time back or see a log of some kind can really help them understand your systems in a way that they can't if they're forced to always move forward and only look at the future, because a lot of things happen in this present moment, and maybe it's too much. And finally, narrative designers, it can be very, very helpful to try to come up with a way for the player to have an identity that's a little bit more insightful than the average human. I think some of the most successful systemic games have actually given the player an almost demigod kind of view, and that's not an accident. I think that it's a lot easier to have players opt into all this information and have so much information if they're not quite human. I think that even hackers get a little bit more information than the average person, but maybe brainstorm a bunch of different ways that they could do that. So if you're allowing an algorithm to join your team, or a heavily system-driven engine to drive your gameplay, then help them out. Help them get some support from the rest of your design team. There's a lot of different ways you can make them more powerful, more effective. And at least that's what I believe. I think even in the simplest games, or the most complex games, I want all of the systems to be as legible as possible so I can use them to deepen the gameplay. The whole design team should be working together to make the game more clear, more distinct, more coherent, and meaningful. And maybe someday I can figure out a way to generate a weapon babe that I find that fits my requirements. But of all the systems that we can make legible, probably romantic relationships are one of the hardest, but that's okay with me. Thank you. So there's no timer on this thing. I don't know if there's 5 minutes? All right, wow, I did it. Yeah, does anybody have any questions about anything? I could talk about systems, boyfriends, wide open. No.
Hey.
Hi.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I just bought your book. Awesome.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm dealing with some frustration in my studio where basically I want to be part of those conversations where basically UX design has a massive impact on gameplay. Do you have any suggestions how to go about that? Because it's a struggle. Where it's like, they just think UX, UI just does, they just do the menus, right? But the reason why, because I did the class with Celia, and Celia basically tells like Fortnite is such a big success right now because the way they do the tutorials, and so I'm a firm believer in that, but I just would like to have some suggestions.
Honestly, without knowing more about your office, it's going to be really difficult. That sounds more like a politics problem. But something I can advise is maybe it can be useful to not use the word UX sometimes, Because honestly, there's so much overlap between UX and game design, and game design has a longer history of getting respect or being important. And so if you just kind of pretend that what you're talking about is it's not UX, it's game design. It's possible I might step on more toes. Right. Yeah, I'm hearing yeah. But it's also possible that you could get a game designer on board with you. Say, yeah, you know what, that is better design. And you can find allies that way rather than trying to be like the one warrior. That I honestly, it totally depends on who's blocking you and why. Okay. But good luck.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I actually had a very similar question to that, so I'm glad that we have like-minded people. I'm going to ask it in a little different way. How do you get kind of those feedback features and those kind of things integrated into your MVPs, showing, like, can you give an example of like how you've done it before?
So I think that that's where the user stories become very, very important, and making them detailed with the kinds of feedback that you're talking about. Because being able to prove, like, okay, this is what we described as the minimum viable, is that the king needs to cry when he sees the portrait. Why isn't he crying? That can help you a little bit. But production is a different problem a little bit. I think part of it is, yes, being able to speak other people's languages and help them see, like, the minimum viable is the player understanding XYZ, right? Like, it's not just having it in the game. The player needs to see them. And so maybe getting a way to get that into the feedback forms and say, no, look, our MVP, like, doesn't have the core features we said it would. Not to the player, and that's who matters, right? Right. Maybe more people can help with that.
Cool, thanks.
Hey there.
Hi.
Hi, so, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Hi, sorry. So how do you know if you've gone way too far in expressing and articulating a system, specifically for the purposes of UI, like just having so much on screen because you just feel really strongly about this particular thing, and how can you maybe come back from the brink of having too much on screen?
I mean, I think that's why I added the word opt-in. I mean, it depends on your audience, of course. I mean, Crusader Kings 2 and Dwarf Fortress, I mean, that's an audience. Like, they want certain things on the screen that maybe the rest of humanity does not. But by identifying first who that audience is very clearly, that helps first, because we have a debate, we have an unannounced game right now that we're working on that's system-driven, and some of it is like, oh, it's very overwhelming when it's on screen, and other people are like, well, but they get over it after 2 minutes. Like, how do we parse this? And part of that is the target audience, but part of it is also figure out how to make the prioritization of, like, what is the most important, make sure that's first, and then hide everything else in an opt-in system except for that. Like, but it is tricky to agree on what is the highest priority, because everything feels like it's the highest priority. Everything's important. Everyone loves their children, but you gotta pick something that goes on the top and play test it.
Thank you.
Good luck. Do we have time for one more? Is it okay? One more. All right. Yes. Hi.
Hi. So about like the user story example that you showed, it's actually the first time I've seen it in like kind of the character point of view, because like in UX so far I've seen, like as a user, when I try to achieve this, I want to be able to do that. But then with that, it seems like it's more of a game design like point of view, like from characters. So can you elaborate a little bit on how we can use it in that way rather than like as a user I want to do?
Yeah, I should have clarified. I didn't mean user stories in like, this is what should be in the Jira task, or anything like that. Or even probably what a normal UX designer would mean by this subject. What I meant when I wrote that was, this is something a player might tell another player. The player might say, hey, I noticed my king was depressed, so I changed the painting and now he's less depressed. Like, that's really like the super summary. And so, it's character focused because that's what I think that the players in that particular game would latch onto as the emotional core. The emotional core in that game was the king, and identifying with him and understanding his motivations. And so exposing as much about him and why he felt better or worse or was crying or whatever was the important thing in that example, which is why it focused on the characters. But if it's a game that's not about characters, then maybe the players, and maybe it's not a user story, maybe it's a player's tale. It's something the players might tell each other because they care about it. And so whether or not that it involves characters depends on your game. But I hope that makes that clearer.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.